Hello student, welcome in the classes of data manipulation and analysis. In concept of database, we learn entity relationship model. Today we learn some components of entity relationship model or ER model or ER diagram. So let us learn components of an ER model. In the components of an ER model, first we learn what is entity. Then entity set, attributes and the relationship. Now what is entity? So entity is what I already told you, that entity is any object, any class, any person, any place. So in the ER diagram, for example, manager, product, employee, department, student, that all are taken as an entity, and the entity is represented in a rectangular box. This rectangle is used to represent an entity. Now what is an entity set? Entity set means, for example, E1, E2, E3, that all are entity of the same type. So this is known as an entity set. An entity is an object of entity type, and set of all the entities is called as an entity set. So over here, this rectangular box represents entity, that is the student. This is the entity type student, and this E1, E2, E3, these are the entities of the entity set. Now next is an different two types of entities are there. There is weak entity and strong entity. So the entity which is already depend on some another entity is called as a weak entity, and the entity which is not depend on any other entity or any other schema or entity of that schema, that is known as a strong entity. Two types of entities are there, weak entity and strong entity. So the entity which is depends upon some another entity is known as an weak entity, but some entities which are not depend on some another entity as well as which is not depend on some entities of the schema, that is known as a strong entity. Strong entity always have a primary key, unique key. Now the weak entity represented by a double rectangular box, and the strong entity is represented by in a single rectangular box. So this is a strong entity which is represented as a single rectangular box, but the double rectangular box represent for a weak entities. Now next is an attribute. What is an attribute? Attribute is used to describe the property of an entities, and the ellipsis, that means oval shape, is used to represent an entities of an attribute. So the oval shape is used to represent like this ellipsis, like this. It used to represent the entities of an attributes. So एट्रीब्यूट्स को रिप्रेजेंट करने के लिए आपको ओवल शेप और दिस एलिप्सिस के अंदर एट्रीब्यूट्स का नाम लिखना पड़ेगा. सो over here the attributes of students entities are roll number, name, date of birth, age, address, mobile number. So the attributes are known as an property which is defined the entity type. For example, the attributes of an entity employee, employee number, employee name, department, salary, designation, that's all are known as an attribute of an entity employee. So what is an attribute? Attribute मतलब attribute क्या है? Attribute एक entity की properties है. टेबल के अंदर जो field है, columns है, that columns or fields are known as an attribute of that particular entity. जैसे student के अंदर roll number, name, date of birth वो attribute है. Employee टेबल के अंदर employee number, name, salary, designation. Then product टेबल के अंदर product number, product price, discount, that all are the attributes. Now the attributes have various types. So the types of an attributes like key attributes or single value attribute, multi-value attribute, composite attribute, derived attribute, like that. Now the symbol, that is ellipsis, is used to define an attribute. Same way, so first attribute is the key attribute or single value attribute. Now the attribute which is uniquely defined each entity, जो attribute हर एक एंटिटी को यूनिकली आइडेंटिफाई करता है, वो एंटिटी को क्या बोलेंगे? की एट्रीब्यूट और सिंगल वैल्यू एट्रीब्यूट. फॉर एग्जांपल, इन द स्टूडेंट टेबल रोल नंबर इज यूनिक. इन स्टूडेंट टेबल रोल नंबर कभी भी डुप्लीकेट्स नहीं हो सकते. एक ही स्टूडेंट के दो रोल नंबर डिफरेंट नहीं हो सकते. दो रोल नंबर से कोई एक स्टूडेंट रिप्रेजेंट नहीं हो सकता. तो हर एक स्टूडेंट के पास अपना खुद का एक यूनिक रोल नंबर होगा. सो दैट रोल नंबर इज एन एट्रीब्यूट विच इज नोन एज अ सिंगल वैल्यू एट्रीब्यूट और की एट्रीब्यूट. सो व्हाट इज अ की एट्रीब्यूट और सिंगल वैल्यू एट्रीब्यूट? द एट्रीब्यूट विच इज यूनिकली आइडेंटिफाई द एंटिटी. हर एक एंटिटी को यूनिकली आइडेंटिफाई करता है, ऐसा एक एट्रीब्यूट होता है एंटिटी के अंदर. वो एट्रीब्यूट को हम क्या बोलेंगे? की एट्रीब्यूट और सिंगल वैल्यू एट्रीब्यूट. Like roll number from the student. Same way employee number or employee ID from the employee table. So employee table में employee ID unique रहता है. Department table में department ID unique रहता है. Product table में product ID unique रहता है. तो वो उसके key attributes हुए, single value attribute हुए, जो एक ही हो सकता है compulsory. Fine. And if you want to represent an attribute or key attribute or single value attribute, then you can use this underline under this particular attribute. For example, roll number. Roll number is an attribute, so that's why it is defined in this ellipsis sign. Yes, but it is a key attribute, that's why the underline is used to represent this key attribute. Fine. So roll number के नीचे मैंने underline किया, वो क्या रिप्रेजेंट करता है? इट इज अ की एट्रीब्यूट और सिंगल वैल्यू एट्रीब्यूट. सेम वे composite attribute. Composite attribute means the attribute which is composed of many other attributes is known as a composite attribute. It's very simple. For example, the address. Address is a one attribute, but it composed of many other attribute. Like address के अंदर आप street का नाम लिखते हो, city का नाम लिखते हो, state का नाम लिखते हो, country का नाम लिखते हो. तो ये सब मिला के आपका एक attribute हुआ. कौन सा? Address. So that address is known as a composite attribute. So the composed of many other attributes are known as a composite attribute. It is represented like this in a single oval shape or ellipsis sign. Yes, so the address attributes of student entity which consist of street, city, state, countries, like that. So वो आपका क्या हुआ? composite attribute. बहुत सारे डिफरेंट एट्रीब्यूट को मिला के एक एट्रीब्यूट बनता है, उसको हम composite attribute बोलते हैं. फाइन. किसी के घर के एड्रेस में फ्लैट नंबर, बिल्डिंग नंबर, ब्लॉक नंबर, यस, एरिया, ये सब लिखा होता है, तो वो सब मिला के एक एड्रेस होता है. दैट्स व्हाई इट्स नोन एज एन composite attribute और composed of many other attributes are known as an composite attribute. And it is represent like simple ellipsis sign like this. Address is represented as a composite attribute which includes street, city, state and country. Now the next is the multi-value attribute. Multi-valued attribute means ऐसा attribute जिसके पास एक से ज्यादा value हो. So the attribute which consisting more than one value for a given entity, it is known as a multi-value attribute. सिंपल थिंग है. अब तो हर एक के पास दो फोन नंबर होते हैं, आपके एक मोबाइल के अंदर भी ड्यूअल सिम होता है. दैट मीन्स कि आपके पास दो अलग कॉन्टेक्ट नंबर हो सकते हैं. आपके पास दो अलग रोल नंबर हो सकते हैं. नो. आपके पास दो अलग एनरोलमेंट नंबर हो सकते हैं. नो. बट आपके पास दो फोन नंबर हो सकते हैं. सो दैट फोन नंबर contain more than one value. So that's why the phone number as an attribute which is known as a multi-value attribute. and if you want to represent the multi-value attribute then it is used double oval, मतलब double ellipsis sign आपको use करनी है to represent this multi-value attribute like this. मैंने यहाँ पे फोन नंबर लिया है और उसको डबल ellipsis sign में डबल ओवल शेप में represent किया है. That means it represent the multi-valued attributes. Now the next is the derived attribute. Derived means ऐसा attribute जो किसी और value से हमें मिलता है. So the attribute which can be derived from other attributes. कोई other attribute से हमें derive होता है, ऐसे attribute को हम क्या बोलते हैं? Derived attribute. So it's very simple example. आपको age find करना है. आप normal age तो find नहीं कर सकते. आप age किसके ऊपर से find करोगे? But obvious things है date of birth पे से. So you can find it out the age as an attribute from date of birth attribute. तो date of birth एक attribute है जिसके ऊपर से आपको age मिलती है, तो that is known as an derived attribute. And in ER diagram DR attribute को represent करने के लिए dash ellipsis का use होता है, dash oval shape का यहाँ पे use हुआ है like that. So it represents the derived attributes. Fine all of you? Yes. सेम वे अगर किसी की रिटायरमेंट एज ढूंढनी है तो उसकी ज्वाइनिंग डेट से रिटायरमेंट तक की पूरी सारी डेट हम लोग फाइंड आउट करते हैं. तो वो रिटायरमेंट डेट हमें कहाँ से डिराइव करने पड़ता है? ज्वाइनिंग डेट पे से. सो वो भी आपकी क्या हुई? डिराइव्ड एट्रीब्यूट. सो ऐसे एट्रीब्यूट जिसको आपको किसी और एट्रीब्यूट से डिराइव्ड करना पड़ता है तो वह एट्रीब्यूट को हम बोलेंगे derived attributes. So over here see, this is the example of student entity. This is your student entity. Student entity has a roll number, name, date of birth. Yes, these all are single attribute. But this double ellipsis size represent what? Double ellipsis size represent a multi-value attribute, that is a phone number. Same way age. So age is represent as a derived attribute. Why? Because it represent in a dash oval shape or dash ellipsis. Same way the address is a composite attribute. That's why the address is represented as a composite like country, state, city, street. ये सब इसके अंदर composed हुआ है. So this all are a single example of all the attribute with the entity type students. Fine all of you. So there are different types of entities, strong and weak entities, then attributes, key attribute, single value attributes, composite attribute, multi-value attribute and derived attribute. Fine all of you. So in the next session we learn the relationship between the entities. Thank you.